This is part 1 of lecture 2, Principles of Form and Design. In this lecture, we're going to go over some general terminology related to the page, and then we will focus on the four main principles of design using the acronym HOUSE. All right, let's get started. Elements of a page. All right, so I will make pauses as I go, so feel free to shout out the answers and make this a little more fun and interactive-y. Here we go. All right, so this is a screenshot of just a page in Adobe InDesign, and we're going to just go over the different elements on a page. As you all know, InDesign is the software of choice whenever you're designing a multi-page document. For many designers, it is just really your go-to software for designing any type of communication because InDesign gives you a lot more features as far as typesetting goes. You, of course, can use Illustrator when you're working on like a single or two-sided postcard or poster, but oftentimes people will just use InDesign since they use it all day, every day. So we should go over the different elements of the InDesign page. Okay, let's see what we got here. So the purple line, or pink, depending, I guess, on what you want to call it, outer rectangle is the margin. Okay, so margins are the blank space between the edge of the page and the start of text, right? That little visual barrier, which you as the designer can choose what you want to set it to, how large or small you want your margins to be. It just helps the reader have a visual break between the start of the page and the information. You could have margins that are the same all the way around or not the same. It's up to you. So here are 3 examples of communications, and they all are employing margins, right? So again, it's the space between the edge of the page and the start of the information or visuals. Oftentimes you can have individual elements that break the margin. For example, in the center spread of the magazine article, right, you can see there's a left-hand margin where the text starts, but the image bleeds off the side of the page. So the image is breaking the margin on the left and on the top to create a nicer layout. But then on like the Thailand poster on the right, the image and the text is all within a certain margin on the page. So there's a light yellow border, right, between the edge of the page and the start of the actual poster content. Okay, so margins. And here I can draw the purple box on these different communications and highlight where the margins are. Again, you can see that the margins don't have to be the same all the way around, and the margins are your choice, whether you want large margins, small margins, but oftentimes you need some sort of margin for text. All right, the next line is this black line. That is the trim. That is the actual size of your piece of paper or of your design. Okay, so if this is a 8.5 by 11 flyer, the black line is denoting 8.5 by 11. So again, here are 3 examples. The trim line will be the outer edge of each of the communications. Okay, and again, whether you get to dictate the size of your design or an assignment or a client does, the final size after it's been printed and cut out or trimmed is the trim size, the black line you see on the InDesign page. All right, and our last line here is that red rectangle. That is the bleed line. So bleed. Bleed is your insurance policy. It is the extra space you want to give past the trim for any ink coverage. So that will often involve photography. If you have a large colored rectangle, to make your poster have a yellow background, you do that with a yellow rectangle, that shape would bleed as well past the trim. So the standard allotment of bleed is 1/8 of an inch, 0.125. You could make the bleed any size you'd want. Oftentimes a print vendor will give you a certain bleed that you need to set your document to. But if no one tells you a number, just assume 1/8 of an inch. This is insurance, like I said. So that means after you've printed the document larger than the final trim size so that the ink can go past the trim marks, when you cut it out, in case your cutting isn't exactly precise, you don't end up with a little sliver of white page, and instead you have the same ink coverage. So whether your trim is not quite perfect or it is, in the end, your printed material will look excellent because you'll have the picture or the color going from edge to edge. So you can see that in the example on the right. All right. The next piece is the column gutter. So this example page is set up with a 2-column layout, right? You could have just a 1-column document, which would have no column gutter because the information would just span from left margin to right margin, like a letter, say. But if you wanted to have multiple columns of information, you could set that in your InDesign document. And the space between those columns is called the column gutter. Again, it's the visual space between the different columns of text. So here is that magazine spread, and you can see that it is a 3-column design, as I've highlighted these purple boxes for you. The easiest way to tell is by looking at the text on the left-hand page, right? The body text is clearly in 3 columns, and you can see that gap between the columns is the column gutter. The page on the right, the first column is a little bit wider than the actual grid looks like, but it's more than likely maintaining that 3-column layout, but I would say the designer probably faked it out to get top 5 to fit, in a column on one line. Okay, so anyway, columns and column gutters, the spacing between the columns. All right, so those were your basic terminology of elements of a page. That way it helps when you're trying to describe the text within a layout to know some of those terms. All right, so we'll try to use those terms in class. All right, the next section is going to be the acronym HOUSE. Okay, so these are just 4 principles of design that we should implement in all of our designs to help create better designs. All right, how many times can I say design in one sentence? All right, so HOUSE, it's an acronym. Stands for hierarchy, alignment, unity, and space. And we're going to go over each of these principles. And this part of the lecture, there's a lot of visuals, so even if you find what I'm saying redundant or boring, at least enjoy all the posters that I've pulled and different visual samples to help, inspire your creativity. All right, let's start with hierarchy. Okay. So hierarchy, it's all about what element do you see first? Do you see second? Do you see third? How is your eye going to travel around the communication? And while we're talking about this in the lecture, and when you're looking at different works, you should try to train your brain to be very aware of how your eyes are naturally traveling along a design. And oftentimes as you stare at something, you no longer have any idea how your eyes were traveling because you've been looking at it for too long. So what you should do is look away, look at like a blank wall just somewhere else for a couple seconds, and then come back to your design. and really just let your eye travel the design and be very conscious about how that happens. Okay? And how that happens is really the hierarchy of visual information. Where does your eye land? What does it see first? What is it seeing second? And what is it seeing third? So take a second and look away and look back. And how does your eye traveling along this poster? Okay, so there are a few different techniques you could employ when trying to create a hierarchy. The first one being isolation. So in all these slides, you'll see on the left, I have a panel that has a very basic composition to get the concept across. Okay, I'm using just some gray houses on a white square, and I'm showing you the most fundamental principle at play. Okay, and then on the main part of the slide, you have much more beautiful and much more interesting compositions that are also using the same principle. Okay, so the first one is emphasis through isolation. The thing that is separated from the group is going to get the attention. Okay, so you can look at these three examples on the right. You've got the first one with the yellow rectangles, right? The information that's been like boxed out on that first top rectangle has been isolated. It's been physically like squared off from the rest of the information and the other visuals, so it's going to get the emphasis. The horizontal banner ad, right? There's a couple principles at play at that one, but one of the main points of emphasis is the circle with the cylinder in the center of it, right? It has been literally circled and again visually separated from the other elements on the design to draw attention to it. And then the bottom poster of the little boy with the slingshot, again, there are many cranes working together at the top of the screen and then, or the page, and then the boy has been isolated at the bottom. There's not really a background around him. He is just a colored figure on a white page, drawing your attention. Another technique is creating emphasis through scale. So again, the larger thing is going to draw your eye. It's also going to sometimes help become a visual guide to move your eye amongst a page design as well, which I think is definitely at play in the McDonald's ad, right? There's a giant 7 and your eye kind of falls down the tail of the 7 to read the rest of the communication. Similarly, the poster on the left with the keys has a very large shape, and your eye follows that shape up and down to view the rest of the communication. So scale. The next one is direction. If you create shapes that are reminiscent of arrows, our eye will naturally follow the arrow, right? So even in my very simple composition, I've elongated those houses to really make them feel more like arrows, and now it looks like a bunch of upward facing arrows. And your eye will naturally just travel up the arrow shapes to whatever is there. In that case, nothing. All right, but in these other posters on the right, you've got the beak of the swan pointing down to the words Black Swan. And then you've got that pen/microphone visual, and the tip of the pen, again, is pointing down to the main details of that advertisement. The next one is contrast of color. So hierarchy through contrast. Color is one way to create contrast. So again, the thing that is the most colorful or the thing that is colored in the example on the left with the jazz concert, right? There's a little bit of orange text. that's obviously going to pop off of a very black and white poster. So the thing that is colored in a black and white situation, the thing that is the most saturated color or the most vivid color, like in Memories of a Geisha, those red lips, are going to draw your eye. They're going to gather the attention of the viewer and create a point of hierarchy. Another way to create contrast is through detail. The thing with the most detail is going to draw your viewer's attention because it takes the viewer's brain longer to process more detail than less detail. So something like the poster on the right, Give Peace a Dance. That point of the illustration where there's like all those different legs and there's lots of color and there's a lot of things happening at that moment in the poster. It's a lot of visual information. So it takes the viewer's brain a minute to really absorb what's happening there. And that is going to, again, create a sense of hierarchy and focal point. Another way to create hierarchy through contrast is in shape. A different shape will stand out amongst the rest. So if you have very, up and down vertical shapes, and then you throw in a more organic shape, like that Casablanca poster in the center, the organic shape, the irregular shape, will stand out. Same thing with like the big spiral circle thing in the Vertigo poster, and even the Blue Cat Cafe. Everything is sort of very up and down, and then there's that nice arc that says Blue Monday Open Mic Night, which kind of pops off the composition. So a change in shape will draw a viewer's attention. And then I think this is the last one, contrast through texture. So again, the more texture, the more visual detail, the more the viewer is going to be drawn to that part of your composition, and they're going to spend time absorbing what they're seeing. So it's similar to detail. Texture could just be another type of detail. So again, in the RS ad, the R and S are made out of like leaves. So that sort of draws your attention, right? There's a bit of texture. There's some three-dimensionality to that part of the advertisement. So that's going to get the viewer's attention. And then the magazine cover on the right there. So in that one, I would argue that the texture is actually the photograph of the woman, since the rest of that ad or magazine cover is, right, just a gray with white text. And while that is all a texture, the part that's different and that pops out is the photography. Okay, so here were our different ways that we can create hierarchy and focal point and help lead our viewer's eye in our communications. So the things we just talked about were isolation, scale, direction, and contrast. Contrast through color, detail, shape, and texture. All right, so let's put our knowledge to work. So again, I realize you're listening to this pre-recorded, but try to follow along, try to guess out loud at what you're seeing here. All right, so again, don't forget, you can always look away and look back and really think, really concentrate on how your eye moves around these different samples. So looking at this ad, what is the first thing you see? And then how does your eye travel the communication? So the first thing I see is the top of that flower with that little green leaves, right? Because that green is a color difference, right? It really stands out on this very red and white ad. There's also a lot of detail right there, right? It's very delicate flower and the leaf petals. It's also in the center of the page. So that is where my eye immediately goes to first. And then my eye travels down that squiggly stem, which you might have also noticed is the negative space of two people kissing. And then my eye naturally falls to the right since we read left to right. So my eye will naturally gravitate towards the right. I see the Coca-Cola logo. I go up and my eye follows the edges of the page in a counterclockwise way. So that's how I look at the poster. Otherwise you might get down to the bottom of that squiggle and then jump up to the top of the communication and read plants make us happy, and then read it maybe clockwise that way. So your eye could travel a couple different ways, but I think the flower at the top with the green is definitely the focal point and definitely the first thing that my eye, and I think most people's eyes, see when they look at this ad. Isn't that clever? I love that little flower / kissing face. Good ad. All right, here's another poster. So look away and look back. And what is your eye seeing first and second and third, and how are you traveling the page? So again, I think there's obviously a bit of direction at play. There's an arrow in that illustration. There's definitely also some color contrast with the orange of the arrow and the orange headline, cul-de-sac, May 5th through 9th. So again, my eye is looking at that orange arrow. I'm seeing the large illustration within and around the arrow, and then I'm traveling down the poster. I'm reading cul-de-sac, May 5th through 9th, and then I'm seeing the theater project logo and the rest of the information. Okay, so this is the last one. This one's a bit of a challenge one, so give it a minute, look away and look back and think about, what are you seeing first? How is your eye moving around the page? What do you think the hierarchy of visual information is here? Okay, so did you think it was the scuba diver? Did you see the scuba diver first, or did you see the whale? This one I like throwing in there because you could really argue for either one as the true focal point of this design. There are different elements that would support either case. So, and I throw this one in there because I think design, well, obviously design is subjective, and I think if you as the designer can defend the decisions that you made, then how can anyone really tell you that you're wrong? If you're designing with a point of view and intentionally, then it's really easy to defend your work and for everyone else to have to kind of roll with it. Okay? So if you are arguing that you saw the scuba diver and you think that they are the focal point because they have the most detail and they are isolated on the page, it's just a dark blue shape amongst that field of light blue, I think that would be a perfectly reasonable argument. If you're arguing for the whale because it takes up the most amount of space for scale, right? It has a little bit of detail. It has some color contrast to it. It's not just a silhouette. And it has a bit of a nice arc swoop of the tail, right? Maybe your eye sees the whale and then travels up the tail and kind of swoops into the scuba diver. And then it swoops back down to the whale and it has this nice circular motion to it, which then makes you feel like the whale is the focal point and the most important part of this page. So either way, I think you could make the argument, and either way, I would say, sure, definitely. It could definitely be that. Okay, so stand up for your work, defend your work, and also be very conscious about why you're making the decisions that you're making. A lot of times we're going to intuitively design things and arrange elements on the page, but don't forget to step back and, scrutinize your work and make sure you understand why you made the choices that you made and that they are the best choices. Okay? Good work. All right, let's move on to alignment. So alignment is all about it's called structural visual connections. Alignment is the hidden underlying like grid or verticals and horizontals that you put into place to help give order to your designs and help give it structure. This is what makes a design look sloppy or look professionally designed. Okay, alignments, making sure everything is placed in a way that helps support the larger design goals of your communication. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple different ways that alignments will work. So here's my favorite Coca-Cola ad again. So there are a few different alignment techniques that you could employ. You could align to the frame, and then the second one is going to be you can align to the other elements within the composition. And honestly, more often than not, you're going to do a little bit of both. So option C, all of the above. All right, but this ad is definitely showing you a great example of aligning to the frame and aligning to the four corners. So as you can see on the left, my little houses, right, aligning to the four corners of the page. And the Coca-Cola ad does that beautifully. There's just a little bit of information in each of the four corners. But you'll notice the nice margins, right? Okay, so still margins are important in alignment. All right, so you could also align to the frame, to any of the edges of your frame, right? Whether it's the bottom or the side or the top or the top left corner, whatever you want to do. It's just about putting information near an edge of your page. So the example is in front of you, right? The one with the person made up out of animal shapes. The information is obviously aligned to the bottom edge of the page. The orange poster, the information, the text is aligned to the bottom right-hand corner of the page, right? Because it is right aligned, and the signature, if that's the logo, has the same right-hand edge. If you drew like an invisible vertical line down the right side of the text, the edge of the signature would match that same edge. So that would be like the right-hand margin of this page. And it's all near the bottom of the frame as well. So it's aligned to the bottom right. Okay. A very common technique, especially in advertisements or in poster design, is to align to the center of the page, right? So these two examples, all the information is placed not only horizontally centered, but vertically centered as well on the frame. The other way you could do alignments is to align to other elements within your communication. So you can see some examples on the left side with my gray shapes, right? I can align the tiny houses to the big house. I could align everything to the same baseline, right? That invisible horizontal line. Think like baseline as in typography. Baseline is the same term you're going to use when you're talking about the bottom edge of any visual elements. I could align to the different edges of the shapes. So that same idea of aligning to edges is definitely at play on what probably the first thing you saw were those giant red lips, right? Big color contrast draws your attention. So the text was like, it's on those little curves that are following the contour of the lips. So for sure, text is aligned to the element of the lips on the page. And then the other secondary information, right, that chai lot in the red box on the top left, definitely tucked onto the top left corner of the frame, and the white information tucked to the bottom right-hand corner of the frame. And if you really, really squint or you have a big monitor like I do, there's even a tiny bit of information tucked to the bottom left corner of this. I think it's an advertisement. Okay, so like I mentioned, you're going to probably align to not only other elements, but the frame as well for all your different pieces of text within your communication. The poster just below the lips, designed for dance. Again, so you have a bunch of alignments to each other in the way that there is definitely some imaginary vertical lines running down the page to make sure that the text at the top is at the same point as the text on the bottom, right? It's all left aligned to an invisible vertical line there. So again, the fact that it's all perfectly aligned to the same imaginary rules is what helps give your communication a sense of structure and a sense of intention. And then finally, you have the magazine spread. And this one, there's a lot of information, right, within the spread. And there's definitely alignments, again, both to the frame and to other elements within the design. So why don't I give you guys a minute, study that spread, magazine spread, and see if you can figure out what types of alignments are at play. Okay, so what did you guys come up with? So you probably guessed how many columns is this spread. So it's a 3-column grid. So there's a hidden alignment of, as you saw the beginning, like the very beginning of our lecture, right? There's 3 columns of information with column gutters, the spacing in between. The right-hand page of the spread kind of makes it really easy to see the 3 columns. So it's a 3-column grid. There's like a nice margin, right? And all of the text is aligned to the columns, which are aligned to the margins, which is aligned to the frame edges. So you can kind of start to see how these are designed and the underlying logic or alignments below, right? So then like the 2 inset photos on the right-hand page, those are the width of the 2 columns. So those are aligned to the columns, which is the other elements of the page. Similarly, the large image on the left-hand page is the same width, I think. It might be a little bit smaller. I'd have to get out a... No, I think it's the same width. Looks like it's 2 columns wide as well. And then things like basic facts underneath is that left alignment to that left edge of the main photograph and probably the center column, but it's not quite as wide. Okay, so you can see how these different text blocks and images are all aligned to the overall frame and underlying grid structure of the spread, as well as to each other to help create a sense of balance and consistency. All right, so here again are just some of the general types of ways you could align elements in your compositions. You could align to the 4 corners of the frame, any of the edges of your page or your frame, dead center of the frame, and then you could also align to other elements within the composition, right? Like around the contour of the lips, or to a baseline where all the elements end on the same bottom edge. or to the side of a larger element, any of those types of alignments. And again, the purpose of alignment is to help create an underlying structure and to help your designs feel professional and not sloppy, help them feel intentional. One of the other things that alignments can do is affect the balance of a composition. So whether you want something to feel off balance or balanced really depends on the alignments, how you choose to arrange your elements. So here are two examples, right? The composition on the left is off balance because all of the visual information is only on the left side of the page. That leaves a big gaping hole, right, on the right side of the page. So it's an off balance design. It's not necessarily wrong or bad, but that is what you've created. If you are trying to communicate something and get across a sense of balance and order and stability, you would probably want to rearrange your composition to create a more balanced design to reinforce what you're trying to communicate. So in this sense, I stuck a big tree over there, right? So that big tree, while it's one single element, is taking up about the same visual space as the 6 houses. And now I have a much more balanced composition. Okay, so here are a couple examples. So the poster on the left with the donuts, right? So if you didn't have the text, that would look a lot like the example I just showed you of my houses, where it would be very off balance. However, the information on the right side of that poster is stacked and spaced in such a way where it's taking up about the same amount of visual space as the image of the donuts. So it feels more balanced. The poster on the right of Janis Joplin, there is visual information, right to left, top to bottom. That is a very dense design and thus very balanced. So here are a couple off-balanced or asymmetrical designs. So sort of like the inverse of the donut poster are these light bulbs, right? There is a bunch of light bulbs on the right, but only one little light bulb on the left. The thing that helps make this composition feel off balance versus the donuts that were balanced is the text. Easy as green is also on the right hand side of this composition, creating much more visual weight on the right hand side than on the left. And again, I think that was completely intentional because it's reinforcing the whole point of this ad to be like this one tiny light bulb will we'll use as much energy as, what are these, 8? These 8 standard light bulbs, right? So the asymmetrical design, the off-balance composition, it's reinforcing the message of, use our light bulb to save energy. The other ad or poster on the right, again, there's a lot of visual information on the bottom right of this poster. There's text, there's a photograph, there's a teal color swoop, there's secondary text, there's a logo. There's a lot of stuff happening on the bottom right side of this poster. The top left, there are some, simple line art, abstract drawings. So the visual weight between the top left and the bottom right is off balance. It's creating an asymmetrical design. It's a really nice design. So again, it's not that it's wrong or bad, but it is what it is. That is what it is. So you should just be aware of what you're creating. Sometimes you might have a radial balance. So when there isn't necessarily symmetrical or asymmetrical or balanced or off balanced, but instead you have visual information in a circle or in like a swirl kind of shape. That's called radial balance. So the two top posters are examples of that. right? You've got all those fish forming like a spiral effect to the little Nemo fish in the center and the logo. So that is much more of like a radial balance. And then similarly, the public theater ad, the text is all spewing out of her mouth. So again, it's much more of a circular or spiral balance to the design. And then also, what about patterns? What about a mosaic? So that is like an all over balance, right? It's a pattern. It takes up the whole composition. It has a regular intervals of information, like in these two examples, so that would be called a mosaic. All right, so let's put our knowledge to the test. Here is a ad. How is this aligned? Is it aligned to the frame, to the other elements? Is it balanced or off balanced? I'll give you a minute to think about it. What do you think? So I would say that this is a little off balance, right? There's definitely more visual weight to the top of this poster than the bottom. And the elements are aligned to each other, right? There's those 4 boxes. They are all aligned to each other where their corners are all coming together. It forms a nice negative space of that cross, right? They're all nicely aligned. And then the headline, which I think is someone's name, is aligned to that yellow square, right? It's bottom aligned, or it's the top of the headline matches the bottom of the yellow square. If you drew an invisible diagonal line along the left edge of that square down, that is where the headline would hit. Then the secondary information is aligned to the headline, right? Again, it's just below, and in this time it's right aligned. So if you drew an invisible line down the right edge of the eye in the headline, that is where the secondary information is right aligned to, and then as well as the logo. So aligned to the other elements within the frame. This is a magazine cover. There's a lot of pieces of information in this cover. So take a minute, look at the different pieces and see if you can figure out how each block of information is aligned. All right, so let's start at the top. So rumor is the masthead, the name of the magazine. That is aligned to the frame, right? It's the full width and it's aligned to the top edge of the frame. Then we have that really long O, which is giving a place for the photograph to rest with, right? So those are sort of aligned to each other. Then if we're going to go to the left, those 3 articles, article names for the headline and the secondary information, those are all left aligned to the, I would say, left-hand margin, which also happens to be the left edge of the R in rumor. And if I followed that invisible vertical line all the way down, you would see that information on the bottom left corner that's on its side is also to the left margin and probably near the bottom margin, I would guess. If we go to the right-hand side of this magazine cover, that sideways information is all aligned to the left or to the right margin, right, or the right edge of that R in rumor. And those 3 lines of text that are running down the right-hand side of the page are all evenly spaced within the width of the R in rumor. If you can kind of see that, if you could draw with your hands just invisible vertical lines on the right and the left edges of that R, you can see all that information fits within that space and is evenly spaced within that space. And then lastly, you have that block of logos at the bottom. So that seems to be aligned to the bottom margin and probably it looks like the right-hand edge of the top of the bold text running down with like the 24.05. So I'd say it falls somewhere along that edge. And that's how this whole magazine cover was designed. That's how it's all aligned. How do you really design this in practice? I would say you kind of put the elements about where you think they should go, and then you come back through and you get out your guides and you actually make sure things are properly aligned. That you do throw that guide in there and you make sure that things are hitting at the exact same spot as you move down the ad. That way it feels intentional, it feels organized, and it doesn't look sloppy. Our third principle, unity. So unity is all about flow, rhythm, repetition, configuration. Unity is definitely at play when you start talking about multi-page documents like books, websites, magazines, brochures, anything that's multiple pages. For sure, principles of unity are very important. But you can also look at unity within a single design as well. So one of the things we'll talk about is unity through repetition. Different things you could repeat would be colors, alignments, patterns, or shapes. What we're talking about is the repeating of visual elements within your design. So whether I'm talking about a one-page design or a multi-page design, you're going to see the same visual elements at play. So let's look at some examples to make this make more sense. So at the top of the slide, you can see there's two spreads. So what are some of the repeating visual elements you can see between the two spreads in the top? So color, right, for sure, right? There's orange on the left spread, it's mostly orange. And then there's orange used again on the right-hand spreads, right? There's orange behind some text. There's an orange call-out quote. There's even a little orange talk bubble element, right? So orange is a repeating element through this design. What would another repeating element be? The circle shape, right? So there's a circle or a talk bubble shape with the where Berlin. And then on the other spread, there's a circle around that large B. There's also another smaller circle around where modern, and then that talk bubble element again. Can you see another repeating element? It would be the diagonal, right? So there's a big diagonal with a teal triangle on the one spread, and the other spread there's a diagonal of where the picture comes in. So these ideas of diagonals is a repeating element. Even if it's not exactly the same angle of diagonal, it's still a repeating shape. And then, so something that you probably can't see because it's small is there's definitely a repetition of typefaces, right? That bubbly where Berlin is the same typeface that's used on the next spread that says we're modern. And I would bet you $1 million that it's the same typeface, same point size, same leading, the small text in the teal talk bubble on the left and in the body text on the right. Okay, so if nothing else, you're going to get unity and through repetition, through using the same typeface, type size, type leading or spacing, line spacing through a multi-page document. Okay? All right, but then like I said, you can also look at principles of unity within a single design as well. So I've got two posters here. Let's look at the one on the left first with the cruise ship. What are some of the repeating elements that are helping create a sense of unity? So one might be alignment, right? The text headline at the top, which I don't actually know what it says, is the full width of the poster and aligned to the top of the frame. The secondary text at the bottom of the poster is also the full width of the frame and aligned to the bottom edge. So again, there's a repetition of alignments. And then you could also probably make the argument that the typeface used for that top headline has very similar shapes and a very similar aesthetic to the actual illustration of those glaciers or snow-capped mountains, right? So it's similar kind of shapes. It has the same sort of feel to it, which helps give a sense of unity, right? There is a uniformity to the typeface used and the illustration style within that poster. All right, let's go over and look at the Ice Pop guitar poster. What are some repeating elements that create a sense of unity in this poster? So for sure color, right? The whole poster is very like red and blue. So there's a lot of different typefaces in this poster and different type sizes and different alignments. However, there is still feels like a unified poster because of the repetition of color. I would also say because of the repetition of shape, right? There's definitely some nice curvy lines at the top with that 0. And then that banner element at the very bottom has that same sort of curvy element to it, which helps sort of cap all of the craziness in between, like a sandwich, right? So I would say those two more organic elements are creating a sense of unity as well. And then this probably doesn't really count for unity through repetition, but definitely the fact that all of this visual information is contained within the center of the poster, I think really also helps give it a sense of order and balance to make the poster work, even though it has a lot of different elements at play. All right, let's look at unity through configuration. So configuration is one of the Gestalt principles. It kind of has to do with when your brain helps you either like see faces in the clouds or like, you know, that a crack in the sidewalk is smiling at you. It also helps you understand that when you have a bunch of disparate objects, if you put them all together, they kind of work as one larger visual object. It has to do with proximity, right? So your brain will naturally group a bunch of similar objects together and make them operate more as one large shape than multiple individual shapes. So looking at the little simple composition in the blue banner on the left, right? So you've got 6 houses. Those 6 houses, the way that they've been arranged, that they're all the same size and same color and near each other, your brain is like, oh, there's a group of houses and there's a group of trees. So your brain is really breaking those 9 elements up into 2 groups. There's houses and there's trees. So you're seeing really, your brain has sorted it into 2 elements versus 9 separate elements. Okay, so that's the principle. Let's put it into practice on these posters. All right, so the first one, the pink one, there's unity through configuration, right? So you've got the 2 yellow, pink circles at the top. They are kind of working as one element. You might see eyeballs. You might see boobs, right? But your brain is grouping those into one shape, and your brain is trying to make a face out of, I think, that poster. And then you also have the repetition of shapes, right? There's the circle shapes at the top, and then there's the 3 circle play buttons at the bottom, and that helps create a sense of unity. The next one in the center, you have all those little animals but they've been arranged in such a way where your brain is able to fill in to the fact that that is a human form, right? So even as the animals kind of start to spread out more and fall more into the negative space, your brain is smart enough to keep continuing the silhouette down. And then configuration and unity at play in the last poster with the saxophone. Again, your brain is naturally it's just gonna group all of those different text elements and that sort of like cloud aesthetic, right? So you kind of see like one central shape to this poster with the saxophone, and it's operating as like one unified visual instead of, you know, 6 or 10 individual visual elements on the page. So that helps create a sense of unity. Since all of those shapes are black and they're all kind of like overlapping a little bit, your brain just is naturally going to group those together as one visual unified element. Same with the logos at the bottom of that poster. So it's really smart to like change all those logos that are, you know, all those companies have different colors and they all have colored logos that they probably sent that designer. But if you had a bunch of colored logos at the bottom of that poster, it would completely detract from the aesthetic and make those logos way more important, right? Because it would be a point of difference, color contrast. So by turning them all black and aligning them nicely to the bottom and spacing them out evenly, it really diminishes them and lets your eye just focus on the primary visual in the center of the poster. All right, so another way we can create unity through configuration, how we arrange elements on the page, is placement. So, right, again, grouping elements together through how you've placed them on the page. Another visual perception principle is we will view flat compositions as they relate to the actual world around us. So if you look at my simple composition, right, I've got 3 trees at the bottom and then a tree and a house at the top. But your brain is telling you that the house and the tree is not actually like above the bottom trees, but it's behind, it's further away in the distance, right? Because when you look outside and out your window, you can see that the trees and the elements closest to you are larger and the things further in the distance are smaller, right? So you know that, your brain knows that. So now when it looks at a flat design, like my trees and house, it automatically interprets the flat visuals to mean, oh, well, that house and tree are smaller than these front trees, so they must be further away. And it creates a sense of depth that isn't actually there. All right, so placement of elements on a page. So I've got 2 different things happening here. Let's focus on the poster first because that more directly relates to my example I just gave you. Right, so you've got a visual of a popsicle and you've got some text, and because of the way that the text has been sort of like flattened and placed under this popsicle, right, it looks like the text is on the ground and the popsicle is like floating up in space, and there's like a fun sense of depth to that, right? There's unity, since that's what we're actually talking about, in the fact that the popsicle and the text are arranged at the same angle. And so they are creating like similar shapes, just further back in space, if you will. Okay, so again, the placement of the text and the placement of the popsicle is creating this cool sense of depth. Unity through configuration or placement of elements on the page also really comes into play with multi-page documents, right? The repetition of putting certain elements in the same spot from page to page, whether that's a physical page or a web page, helps your viewer understand the structure of the information or where to find the different information that they're looking for. So these are a couple screen grabs from the website Fast Company. And one of the elements of placement that's coming into play is the use of where the main visual is, right? So the first like home page, if you will, on the top left of these 4 screen grabs, there's a really big image, which is going to draw your attention in, right? And then there's some text underneath. And where the text is placed in relation to the big visual and how that text on the left is 100% black and the rest of the text is grayed out, you as a viewer understand that that headline relates to that visual, which will help you navigate the website. Other elements of placement that help the viewer understand what's going on here is once I clicked on that article, if I go down to the next screen grab below it, you can see that it's the same visual. So the repetition of that same picture helps me understand that I'm now reading the article related to those TVs. And the placement of the information helps me understand to read just down the page and not get distracted by all the ads on the side. And then similarly, as you move through a website, the placement of the information is consistent so that the viewer knows which part of the website is the actual content versus which part of the website is maybe the navigation, like the top masthead along the top of all the pages, which part of the website is extra information, like you can see the 2 screen grabs on the right. There's like the same right sidebar with like news on one and recommended below. So that's the same type of information and it's placed in the same place, the same location on the different web pages. So as I move about this website, the underlying structure, the grid, is creating a nice sense of unity, which helps your viewer navigate the website and find the information that's relevant to them. All right, so here's our recap. We made it. Unity is always like the most abstract of these 4 concepts, I feel. We've got unity through repetition. You could repeat anything from colors to alignments to patterns and shapes. And we've got unity through configuration, unity through how the elements are placed on a page. And a couple of the things we talked about were creating a sense of depth by playing off of our perceptions of how the actual world works, where things that are closer to you are larger and things that are further away are smaller. Proximity, placing a bunch of like things together helps create one larger visual thing than individual items. And placement as far as underlying structure to help your viewer understand where to find the different types of information that they might be looking for within a multi-page experience. All right, let's put it to play. Here is what I believe is a poster. So let's look at this one and thinking about the principles of unity. What types of elements are in play here to create a sense of unity within this poster design? All right, so maybe did you see the repeating pattern, right? The stair step illustration of the woman's head. So that same idea of stair steps has been repeated in the text. So that the red shapes behind the text have also that, mirroring that stair step image. What else? There's definitely a pattern, right? In the background, there's repeating elements. So a pattern in the back is definitely a unifying feature. There's unity of color palette, right? There's that gold of the background is the same gold of the text. There's the red behind the text is a darker tint of the red of the pattern. And then, using the same typeface throughout all the information, and treating the information in a similar way where it's all right aligned and at the top right corner of the page also helps create a sense of unity within the information text of the poster as well. All right, good job. All right, how about this one? This poster, I think, has really nice flow, right? Doesn't your eye just go like, hot cars, cool nights, and then you kind of like flow down all the cars? The arrangement of the information, I think, makes really nice visual flow. My eye just moves right down this poster, and it's like, I don't know, really plays into the idea of like cruising down a mountain street, right? There's also nice repetition of colors. Everything's like that blue or the red. And there is just nice rhythm, right? The information is broken up into little chunks where your eye can kind of hit each one as it flows through the design. Here's 4 spreads within a larger brochure. What are some of the unifying elements of this design? Yeah, so the margins, the colors, the columns or the alignments, right? The typefaces, the type sizes, all of those things are making this a very unified design. Each spread is unique, but for sure relates to the other spreads in a very obvious way. All right, you're almost there. Great job. The last element we're going to talk about is space. So space can mean the blank page, the boundary of the design, the format, the frame, the spatial plane, the page, the artboard, the canvas. Basically the thing that you are designing. That piece of paper is space, right? That is the space with which you have to work in. Because we are graphic designers, we work for the most part on 2-dimensional pieces of paper. To break it down in the most simple way. So let's talk about space in that way, as well as space as in spatial depth, dimensionality, which you've kind of touched on a little bit already. All right, so within space, we can definitely talk about static versus active compositions. Again, not that one is bad or one is wrong, but there are 2 different types of compositions out there, static and active. And as a designer, it's important to understand what you're designing and if that makes the most sense for what you're trying to communicate. Okay, so here are 3 different posters, all for the same movie / play, Singing in the Rain. I would argue that there is a spectrum of static versus active at play here, where the poster on the left, the umbrella keynote, is a very static composition, right? There's a few elements, they are all arranged in the center of the frame, right? So it's definitely balanced, but it's also very static. There's not a lot of, my eye is not really like moving around that composition too much. It's just right in the center. It's not moving anywhere. I can see everything right there. If I go over to that center poster, the original, I'll add, it's kind of active, right? The top half of the poster, What a Glorious Feeling, is in like, on like a nice little curve, and then Singing in the Rain is on a little curve too. And so my eye is sort of dancing along as it reads the words, and there's a bit of motion at the top. The second half of the poster, with Gene Kelly down, is rather static, right? It's just a bunch of text, again, centered on the page, aligned to the bottom, pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of movement to that information. So like half-half. And then the poster on the right, I would say, is the most active of the 3, right? You've got the man, the photograph, with the way his legs are positioned. It forms that nice diagonal. which is repeated on the top right corner. It's direct from the UK, is typeset in that red strip of diagonal. And then the typeface, Singin' in the Rain, has the photograph within the letter forms of, I'm going to assume, rain, set to that same diagonal. And I don't know if you can tell on your screen, but the whole yellow background has a bit of a diagonal texture to it as well. Additionally, the sort of off-kilter way the different pieces of information have been arranged is really reinforcing this sense of visual diagonal, where my eye is going right top left to bottom right. So that really strong visual diagonal within the poster creates a very active composition, right? It's being reinforced in the way the type has been set, the photography that was selected, and the additional, I'll call it textural photography within the design. So that's a much more active composition. And I think when you see all three of these in context of one another, you can start to understand the difference. All right, so another thing we're going to talk about in far space is open versus closed compositions. So a closed composition would be something where your eye is contained within the page or within the space, right? All the information is within the frame. So poster on the left is closed composition, right? All the text has been arranged into that sort of like diamond shape. Secondary information is tucked to the two bottom corners, and your eye doesn't have to travel outside of the page. It's all right here for you. The poster on the right, unspooling, right, has all of these lines that are jutting out past the edges of the frame. So this is a much more open composition. Your eye is moving all over the frame and also past the frame edges. Obviously, there's no information past the edge of your piece of paper, but your eye is sort of like drawn out and you're sort of start to imagine what's out past the edges of the frame, right? So that's a much more open composition. Again, one is not bad or wrong, it's just two different ways to design. All right, the next thing I want to point out, which you've seen a few examples of this again throughout this presentation, but figure-ground relationship. So just to reiterate, I'm sure most people know this already, right? Figure-ground. What are the objects and what is the background of your composition? So the objects are always going to be things that are recognizable, things that your brain can identify. Letters, photographs, regular shapes. And then everything else that is not an actual thing becomes the background or the ground. So if you look at my examples on the left, right, the first one, what is that, 6 houses? The 6 houses are the figures, and the white is the background. I don't think anyone would argue that point with me. The next one down, the figures. So now there's about equal amount of white space and gray space, right? Or gray elements and white elements. However, the gray elements are very clearly recognizably trees, right? I've zoomed in, they're kind of cropped off, but you can still see that's 2 trees, 2 gray trees on a white background. So again, the figures are the trees and the ground is the white, because the white negative space isn't anything recognizable, so then it's the ground. And it has really nothing to do with white versus black or dark versus light, right? Because the third example has a white house on a gray background. So again, the figure is the white house because it's a house, and the ground is the gray background, okay? All right, so let's look at these 3 examples. So the first poster that says alphabet, right? So there are figures of food, but then, see, then the designer kind of like messes with you, where alpha half the AL is made up of figures, right, of like beans and scallions placed into the shapes of letters. And then as it changes to the PHA, the figures or the letters are really the negative space around the different elements of food elements. So again, so it's sort of like the play, a figure ground relationship. Whenever you kind of challenge our known perceptions of figure ground, it creates a very interesting composition. So in that example, right, the actual food pieces are figures, but then the negative space of the letters that are recognizable as letters also start to become figures. Similarly, Sherlock Holmes, right? Clearly there are figures of the text and the pipe, but then when you look at the smoke off the pipe, you can start to see the silhouette of Sherlock Holmes's face in the red space, right, to the left of the white smoke. So all of a sudden now there's like a red figure within the red ground. Again, so we're kind of like, again, messing with the figure ground relationship. Makes fun, interesting compositions. And now that you know what you're looking for, Peter and the wolf, you might see that there's a figure of a wolf, but then there's also a silhouette of Peter's face in the snow around the wolf, right? So behind the words Peter and the wolf, that white shape is not only ground, but it's also the figure of the boy's silhouette. Fun, right? So fun. Okay, so figure ground. And then sometimes you have designs where there is equal space between the negative and the positive. Think like the yin yang, where you can't really say one element is the figure and one element is the ground because they are equally matched. So that's called equivocal space. And that is when you have this thing like it's a candlestick. No, it's two people looking at each other, and your brain can't decide because it's both. It's both and it's neither, right? Equivocal space. So then you've got the penguin up above, where the belly of the penguin is also a little baby penguin. That one's cute, right? And then below it says 1 Wolverine or 2 Batman. You decide. So Wolverine would be looking at you, and the Batman would be looking at each other. So equivocal space, always fun. All right, and then I think this is the last one. So this is spatial depth. So we've talked about it with that popsicle poster, but the idea of creating a sense of depth or dimensionality within your flat design, right? So a couple ways you can do that. One, we talked about with proximity, right? The perceived scale as related to the physical world. I've got the trees in the foreground and the tree with the house above it on the poster, but our brains perceive that as depth, right? Where the trees in the foreground are closer to us and the tree with the house is in the distance because the same tree is smaller within the same composition, so we just assume that it's actually the same size, one is just further away. That's how that principle works out. Another way to do it is through layering or transparency, right? If you stack objects on top of each other and you show the overlapping, or you just even have like a stroke to define the edges, all of a sudden it feels like there is depth because there are things on top of each other. And of course, light and shadow, right? You pop a drop shadow behind that flat house and all of a sudden it's floating above the piece of paper. And again, all of these tricks to creating spatial depth are all directly related to how things actually have depth in the real world. So let's look at some of these posters. So the Silver Surfer, right? It looks like he's coming towards you. There's those light swoopies behind him, which helps give him a sense of depth and motion in space where he is flying through the air. The Clockwork Orange, right? There is a shadow being cast on them, so that helps. And the direction of the shadow, the way those black shapes are getting larger as they come down the page, gives a sense of depth, where these people look like they're walking either like towards you or away from you, but the sun is behind them, right, to create a sense of shadow and depth. The Swan Lake. That poster is kind of fun, where the text is like actually like woven like in front of and behind the photograph of the dancer. So if you kind of like look at the lettering of Swan Lake and the photograph of the dancer, you can kind of see how it's like, again, it's kind of like messing with your sense of spatial depth, because the letters are like behind and in front of, and it kind of makes a very interesting focal point. And then we'll go down to the yellow poster, ignored every day, right? So the text is all very flat, black on yellow, but then the paperclip, that little drop shadow or that little shadow cast off the paperclip onto the background gives the paperclip a sense of dimensionality, right? It looks like a paperclip has just been placed on top of this yellow poster. But it's obviously just a photograph of a paperclip printed out. It's flat, you can't touch it, but it's a perception of texture. It looks 3D. And then finally the popsicle ad, which we've looked at before, right? The way in which the popsicle was placed on top of the text at the same parallel angles creates the sense of the popsicle is floating in space above the text, which is also sort of like going back in space, perpendicular to the actual flat plane of the poster itself. Spatial depth. All right, here's our recap. So we talked about figure ground, the idea of recognizable items, objects are figures, and everything else is the background or the ground. If you create a design where there's equal recognizable elements in both the figure and the ground, it becomes equivocal space, like the yin-yang. And you could definitely create a nice sense of depth by mimicking things you see actually in nature and in real life in your designs, right? Creating things like drop shadows or overlapping elements helps create a sense of depth within your flat designs. All right, so let's look at a couple examples, test our skills. So in this ad, what are the figures? Right, so there's like a smokestack, there is some smoke, there's a skeleton face on top of the smoke, and there's a logo at the bottom, right? So those are all figures. The background would be the blue, we'll say sky. We've seen this poster before, right? So what are some of the elements at play here to create a sense of space? Right, so that like fabric piece that says designed for dance, looks like it's kind of floating in the air, right? Gives it a sense of three-dimensionality, the way it's been placed and the colors over it. But then also, well, the reason I really like this poster is if you look at the text, the informational text, like program A and program B, so that text is sort of like placed on top of the floating fabric, which feels like it's already floating on top of the gray background of space. So there's like a nice layering of visual elements, right? So that creates an extra sense of depth to the design. All right, and then I have this book cover, or poster, I guess, poster. So again, there's a lot of different elements overlapping each other in unrealistic ways or surreal ways, right? So did you notice it's the silhouette of a person? But then within the silhouette of a person, you see like clouds and mountains and maybe like a stream. And then there's the letters, tame and pala, are like above and below the different elements, nature elements, which are all are making up the silhouette, right? So there's like, again, there's like a lot of senses of depth happening within this one seemingly static, simple composition. There's also this extra element of texture, right, where it kind of all has like that distressed ink print sort of feel to it as well, which sort of adds another layer of depth to the poster, because then it feels like it's actually like ink being pressed onto paper. Whether it actually is or not, I don't know, because I have a digital PDF. But if it is just fake texture, then that would be another sense of depth. So that one's like subtly very complicated. All right, house, you made it. Great job. I know that was a long lecture, so thank you for sticking in here with me, but I hope you got just some good information about helping you to really deconstruct your own designs and start to understand why you're designing the way you are when you're making these intuitive decisions in your compositions, and also to be able to really step back and challenge yourself and think about other ways that you could arrange the same elements to create different compositions, and what would be more or less effective to your overall design goals. So again, HOUSE was our acronym: hierarchy, alignment, unity, and space. Thank you.